Elise opens. Plan B, I will do a very brief opening and hand it over, Remy, to you to kick us off with the presentation, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Remy. Just a backup in case.
Sure.
We have, hopefully we'll have Elise, Barbara, and Jesse with us.
And just a quick thing, if it helps, no, the link didn't work for me either. So I just went to my schedule where I had saved the session and then entered through that, and that worked perfectly. So maybe there's an issue with the link, so we can maybe tell them to do that.
Yeah. Mitra, do you want to just give Elise a call because she's opening us? Should I give it a call? Because I know I'm going to open.
I'm doing it right away.
Thank you, Mitra. Thank you. And Sasha, should we do the same with Barbara? What do you think, Sasha? Should we call Barbara?
I tried to call her on WhatsApp. Okay. Jesse, Elise says she and Jesse are both waiting for the new link. They can't get in.
Okay, and we go live in a minute. And we're live, everyone. I can see folks joining in. We'll probably give everyone another minute and then formally kick us off. Great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our World Water Week session titled Service Subsidies for Water Efficient and Proper Business Models. We're going to look at both drinking water as well as sanitation when thinking about that. And my name is Deepa Karthikeyan. I'm part of an organization called Athena Infonomics, and we're thrilled to be collaborating with some great partners like the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Soil, and Safe Water Network here today to sort of share our experiences. When we came together as a group and started thinking about the session today, and one of the primary goals was to help us, or to help share sort of the work that I think several of us have been doing in different parts of the world, and to use that to reimagine the role that public finance can play in terms of advancing the goals of safe, equitable, and sustainable services for all. We have a really power-packed session today with speakers and panelists who will show from their work and experience how formal financial support from public service authorities can play an exponential role in advancing service goals when structured creatively, and particularly when used to support innovative business models like container-based sanitation solutions and small water enterprises. And we also realize, and we have interesting evidence to show that in several contexts, this may not even be an option. These models may really be the only way to reach the underserved, or the only safe way to reach the underserved target segments. So without further ado, I would like to kick us off for today's discussion presentation. We have three great presenters. We have Remy Kopp who's the executive director of the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance, who will kick us off by sharing the Alliance's experiences in terms of building and scaling CBS business models and what they know is the role of public finance in that context. This will be followed by a presentation by Sasha Kramer from Soil, where Sasha will share with us her experiences of building and scaling a very unique CBS service model in the context of Cap Haitian in Haiti, and will share with us what their experiences have been in terms of financing models and what they see as the value of formalized public financing support. And we have Poonam Sevak, who is the Vice President of Partnerships and Programs at Safe Water Network, who will compare and contrast, in some sense, the journey that safe water enterprises have had in India in the context of drinking water, and where there are both similarities or perhaps differences in the experiences of small water enterprises in the water context, vis-a-vis the sanitation context. So without any further, Remy, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick us off. Thank you, Remy.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me and see the presentation on the screen. Thank you, Sasha. And hopefully we will get the missing panelists. Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for those who are joining very late where they're based. There's a few of you today or tonight. My name is Remy. I'm the Executive Director of the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance, and I want to talk today about public finance for sanitation, and especially for container-based sanitation. So about three things. A bit of a reminder about public investment for sanitation, how we need it. What can you invest in if you want to invest in sanitation, and how you can do that. So I will also talk about container-based sanitation. For those of you that are not familiar with it, there will be a reminder about it, and you saw that coming. So first, let's talk about money for sanitation. The short version is that we need lots of it, really, really lots of it. The slightly 2-minute version now, slightly longer, is that any country that has achieved 100% safe sanitation or close enough has put a huge amount of money in it, huge amount of public money. WASA did some research in it and looked into the various mechanisms like municipal bonds, federal grants, municipal grants, aid, of course, and not just for big infrastructure, but also for toilets, for household connections, for septic tanks, also for operational expenditure. So, for example, this is the beautiful Crossness pumping station in London, part of the sewers done in the 19th century. These have costed about 2 to 7 billion of today's pounds, which comes to around $1,000 to $5,000 per resident to install sewers, with today's dollars. $1,000 to $5,000 per person was spent to get sewers. It's a lot. Closer to now, South Korea. They took about 40 years to have full sanitation as well, transforming many areas which were slums effectively. And this was done by subsidizing between 30 and 70% of the costs. It took ages, and that started before South Korea was a really rich country as well. There's a few myths about sanitation finance that we can address as well. The first one is that household costs are private, like a toilet, like a septic tank, like a pit. It's not true. Most subsidy regimes in the past have funded toilets, and often a lot. WASA did some research, Mind the Gap, which was showing that willingness to pay is around a quarter of the cost of sanitation, what people are ready to pay. That's what they say. What they are actually paying is much lower than this, about 10% of the actual costs. It's not possible to not subsidize private, what is considered private. Tariffs can cover operational costs. That's true in some rich countries, but that distorts our expectations. You take South Korea again. In 2004, they finally achieved cost recovery. Yes, for water, not for sanitation. They're not there yet. It took more than 50 years to get there. It takes ages. You will have to subsidize your ongoing costs for a long, long time. You can't expect more. If you provide an OPEX, an operational expenditure subsidy, it means you are inefficient. You should be covering your cost. Well, no. In many countries, that still happens. That's absolutely normal. An operational expenditure subsidy means that you are serving low-income residents. It doesn't mean that you are inefficient. And the World Bank did a great study, doing more with less, on smart subsidies. And I really recommend this to have a deeper look at subsidies. Subsidies help the poorest. We wish it's often not the case. For example, a recent study was looking at pipe water and was looking at half of subsidies goes to the richest quintile and 6% only to the poorest quintile. There's a big inequality in terms of who benefits usually, but we can change this. So, okay, we need lots of money for sanitation. So the second part is, what can you invest in? What makes sense? The challenge is that we have extremely dense informal settlements with about 1 billion people living in them. So providing sanitation in informal settlements or slums has been done before in Europe, in East Asia, but that was for a lot fewer people than this, about 2 orders of magnitude less. So we have a huge challenge ahead. We've got informal tenure, we've got very low incomes, transient population sometimes, groundwater or even flooding very close. It's a nightmare. For any engineer like me, it's a nightmare. So the main options really mean sewers. So digging, you need space for this, or installing septic tanks, which are great. You also need to dig. You also need to have some space on safe tenure. If you put these, then you need access for emptying trucks. And if there's no space, then you need small pumps, which are not that safe to use, really. If you are going to do this, very often the best option is to do some housing redevelopment. This is in Nairobi, in Huruma. It's beautiful. It's absolutely what we should do. It's also an order of magnitude more in terms of expenditure. We can't afford that. So let's talk about sanitation. A few organizations have done really well in this and have found one possible approach, which is container-based sanitation, where waste is collected in often waterless toilets with removable containers. So everything is above ground, usually. Before you say, of course, Romy, you would say this, that's your job. The thing is, I love TBS, therefore I got this job, not the other way around. So not that obvious. But I absolutely love this approach. There's about 10 providers in the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance, and they're using a wide variety of approaches, of technologies, so there's a lot to choose from. And we're going to hear from Soil very soon on how they approach it in a very challenging context. So the thing is, the reason I like it is that it's very good for when you don't have a lot of water, for producing compost or other products that you can sell, for being resilient to floods, because nothing is underground, and that's for having it in home, because you don't need to dig, so you can put it in a room if you want to. You don't need to dig. For me, that's a big, big aspect. You can work with very informal tenure. You can work with tenants and with landlords. It's very appropriate for informal settlements. Another thing I like about it is people really like it. First, if they didn't like it, they wouldn't even pay for the service. But also, we have verified it a bit more. WhatsApp did a study with Clean Team in Ghana, which was showing satisfaction around 5 areas. It's a tool called Sanitation Quality of Life, SANQUAL. And it was showing comparison with public toilets before and Clean Team and the new toilets after, and showing almost perfect scores afterwards. Especially the biggest improvement was for women. People really like it. And another nice thing about it is that we can know quite well how much it costs. It has been done by a lot of NGOs and especially social enterprises, which have really looked into the cost, into efficiencies. It's a really good way to know how much does the full sanitation chain cost. It's really hard to compare with other technologies because they're often not at the same scale. And we are trying to know this a bit more. At which scale is it efficient? At which scale can we use carbon offsets, for example? What are the other income streams that we can use? But it's really interesting to look at this and have a better idea. So we need lots of money for sanitation. It's really hard to do in informal settlements, but there are some approaches that are promising, and we can know the real cost of it. The thing is, the way sanitation funding works doesn't really work well for this. So we have to rethink a little bit how we do this. I would even say the current funding models are very often broken. So let me show you why for a minute. I'm going to compare traditional sanitation contracting and what I would love to see instead. So typically, you are an authority, you are mandated to provide sanitation, and you have a contract and finance streams for subsidizing toilets or home connections, another for emptying services and transport, another for treatments and reuse. It can work, but you could also have a single contract and for a full chain service and have therefore realized efficiency gains. Typically, you don't really know the full cost of sanitation because it comes from a few different authorities, it goes to a few different contractors, it's not about the same areas. It's really hard to know how much you need, how much it's costing so far. And if people don't like the service, you only know indirectly because people don't, if you do an evaluation of your service, if people don't actually use your service but use informal MTOs instead, even though they're more expensive, what's happening here? You only know indirectly. I would argue that better contracts should include residents' perception as part of the performance metrics. New contracts should embed the amount needed per user served, per household served. And this is possible with container-based sanitation. And typically funding cycles favor projects which have a lot of CapEx. So install a new treatment plant, typically. It's visible, you know the number of jobs, etc. We need to change this. We need to make sure that we embed operational expenditure and software costs in the contracts. And with certain sanitation approaches, like container-based sanitation, but also hopefully others, we can make room for more diverse funding. Results-based financing, if you know the real cost of serving a user, then you can access this. Climate finance, and we are looking at using carbon offsets now for container-based sanitation because it does produce a lot less carbon emissions. I would love to talk more about it, but I'm going to get cut soon. So I'm going to go to the last slide instead. So what can we do? We have to think a little bit different. And I'm going to give you three sort of actions out of this. One is that funders love to do comparisons of different solutions, but we have to do it a bit more fairly. And Deepa and her colleagues have done a lot of work to try and do that. It's really, really hard, but it's very interesting. I would argue that we have to compare to the usual alternative, which is doing nothing. This is what actually happens. While we're busy comparing, nothing happens. And nothing comes with big health costs, with big political costs. You have a lot of people unserved. We have entire lost generations with the compound costs of inaction. And when we compare with sewers, which is the default way of thinking, we should add the real cost. It's not just about installing pipes. It is about, well, if you want to dig, you have to relocate some people. And that's extremely expensive. That's hard to do equitably. You have to take into account the fact that, well, this area is now more formal. That's a 10-year change. That could bring in money, but it's not that easy. You need more water. You need to bring more water to the area. That's another infrastructure installation as well. The second thing is shifting the measures of success. What counts as success in sanitation? For a political leader, it's often open a new treatment plant, open an installation, something you can cut the ribbon to. And this is what the funding cycles from development funders tend to favor. We can change this to, can you serve a whole area safely, fairly? And can you make user satisfaction and affordability key criteria? This is the equitably. And finally, for informal settlements, I'm an engineer. I've been taught repeatedly, you have to think about infrastructure is for the very long term. You think about 50 years. Therefore, you think about sewers. That's completely normal. And maybe sewers will one day come to many areas, but in the meantime, we have to think about the next 10 years. I'm saying 10 years, let's just use that. How can you serve residents safely now, in the coming year, for a solution that's going to last at least 10 years, give you a bit of time, and then you see, well, should we keep using this? Or in the meantime, have we been able to secure, funding for other solutions if this is what we still want? There are ways of doing this. For example, delegated management has been a great method of contracting out water services in informal areas, and it can be done with sanitation as well. If you have good quality sanitation providers, those that you can trust. So if you're a political leader, you should know that people are going to know it is possible to have sanitation in informal settlements. You can have safe, equitable sanitation there. They are going to want it. So if you're a leader, you should go ahead and bring this sort of solutions already now. Thank you very much. I will leave Sasha describe how they do it in soil, and you will see it more in practice now.
Thank you so much, Remy. And, before thank you. This is so great. And before I hand it over to Sasha, I just want to add that the work that we've been doing with Remy and Sasha and others is fascinating because it shows what a complex thing costing can be, right? Like and in one of the patterns that we saw consistently in all of the analytical work that we did was that it's actually more often actually more expensive to serve the poor than it is to serve a median customer, because the structural barriers and challenges sometimes to reach those informal settlements can actually be higher because they're more complex service models. And we also discovered that there is no sort of, here is CBS, you cannot always say CBS is more or less expensive vis-a-vis other alternatives, and what it costs in relation to other service model interventions can vary widely across contexts. But and Sasha can speak to this in ways that I cannot, that in contexts like Cap Haitian, it's probably the only viable way to reach those target segments. So Sasha, over to you to share some of your experiences in Cap Haitian.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deepa, and thank you, Remy, for setting me up so well. And I'm going to, there we go, excellent. Mithra will be doing the slides. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you again. I know that people are all over the world, and I also appreciate your presence here. My name is Dr. Sasha Kramer, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Soil, which is a sanitation service provider working in informal urban settlements in Haiti since 2006. Our goal at Soil is to develop a sanitation service that is rapidly deployable, dignified, safe, and equitable. And today I'd like to give you a short overview of our service while arguing that innovative off-grid services, such as container-based sanitation, merit investment by government and donors. But this, as Remy hinted at, will require a shift in the way that the development community disperses subsidy support. Next slide, please. Here's a very short and slightly outdated video, which might be choppy as well, but I think it's going to give you a sense of how our service operates. Click. Oh. Well, and luckily it has subtitles because we don't hear the sound.
I'm just going to, Ananya, can you check for sound? Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I do, yep, luckily it has subtitles throughout, so I'll just, it's not as great without the background music, and we're missing David Attenborough. Sorry, David. But at least this gives you a sense of what the toilets look like, what the collection service is like, and also how the waste treatment process works. All right. Next slide, please, Mithra. Okay. So Soil is currently serving nearly 12,000 people with a subscription household toilet service. But one of the primary challenges to scale is sourcing financing to fill the viability gap between costs and revenues. As Remy said, traditional subsidy models focus on CapEx investments, and donors have been very uneasy about shifting financing to ongoing OpEx support, which in Haiti and many other fragile contexts around the world has resulted in costly infrastructure projects which are abandoned for a lack of ongoing OpEx financing. We argue that in order for governments and donors to fulfill their moral imperative to provide essential services to vulnerable communities, it's critical to rethink not only the way in which subsidies are structured by shifting some financing from CapEx investments to service subsidies, it's also important to ensure that the service subsidies are decided based on reaching vulnerable communities with safe solutions, rather than always striving to find the cheapest solutions. Undoing centuries of inequality is a costly and time-intensive process. But here are a few of the reasons we believe it's essential to invest in safe services for the poor. Next slide, please. As Haiti does not have any functioning sewer systems, CBS can only really be compared to traditional on-site solutions like pit latrines and septic tanks. Our cost analysis using the CWIS SAP tool demonstrates that the annualized costs of CBS are higher than the costs for on-site systems which are unsafely managed, though the analysis was hampered by some incomplete data. While this graph may appear to justify more spending on pit latrines and septic tanks rather than CBS, I'd like to present a series of arguments for why investment in CBS is more than worth the additional expense. Next slide. To give you a sense of the scale we're talking about, it would cost approximately $3 million per year to subsidize CBS services for 10% of the population of Cap-Haïtien, Haiti's second largest city, and this is a conservative estimate. For perspective, international donors have invested more than 150 million in water and sanitation services for Haiti's northern region over the past 5 years alone, with no clear path to reaching the 11% of the city who have no toilet access whatsoever. So why are we advocating for donors and the public sector to pay for CBS if it's not always the cheapest option? Next slide, please. In vulnerable communities, one of the basic stepping stones to building equity is job creation. And it's really important to view the additional costs of CBS services from this perspective. Next slide. The majority of CBS service costs are for labor, and CBS creates stable employment opportunities all along the sanitation value chain. Next slide. From producing the cover material, next, to the waste collection system, next, all the way through to waste treatment and transformation, there are significant job opportunities created. Next slide. The second component which requires consideration is safety. There are good reasons that pit latrines and septic tanks are generally not permitted in dense industrialized cities in high-income countries. They're simply not safe. This is particularly the case in low-lying coastal cities such as Cap-Haïtien. A recent sanitation zoning study carried out by DAI in Cap-Haïtien demonstrated that the majority of the city, including the most populous areas, is not considered safe for unsealed pit latrines and septic tanks, as seen by the red areas on this map. Next slide. This map shows soil CBS clients overlaid with a 5-year flood map of the city. It's not uncommon for neighborhoods where we provide service to experience several severe flooding events annually, where the waste from pit latrines and septic tanks is washed into the floodwaters, contaminating homes and water supplies. In the absence of sewer systems, which themselves are not completely flood resistant, next, CBS is the one sanitation technology which can serve as an effective barrier to environmental contamination, as the containers can be sealed and placed out of the reach of floodwaters. Next slide. If the only safe options under consideration are CBS and sewers, it's important to consider the timeline for deployment. This map shows the parts of the city which could potentially someday be served by sewers, with the green areas being feasible in the short to midterm and the yellow areas in long term. However, given the need for significant improvements to the city's electricity and water services before sewers could even be considered, it's important for donors to invest in rapidly deployable interventions such as CBS, which can ensure access in the short term. Next slide. In addition to providing sanitation, CBS also provides a suite of positive benefits to other sectors. From an ecological perspective, the recycling of nutrients and human waste can have a transformative impact on soil fertility, food security, and reforestation efforts. At our current scale of 12,000 people, Soil's toilet users are conserving over 30 million gallons of water annually relative to flush toilets. Container-based toilets are also flood resistant, a critical climate adaptation, which could be relevant in many communities globally. And finally, research has demonstrated that soil's CBS system can offset nearly 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per household per year relative to traditional sanitation approaches in Haiti. Next slide. Our analysis shows that in Cap-Haïtien, CBS costs more than the existing unsafe on-site sanitation systems. However, we argue that the poor deserve access to safe sanitation services. Reaching the SDGs will require financial investments which support providers to grow and improve efficiencies in technically challenging poor communities. The economic benefits of expanding access to safe sanitation are well known and significant, and always waiting to invest in services for the poorest by perpetually seeking less expensive options is regressive and unethical. It deepens existing inequities and health disparities, undermines job opportunities, and unfairly creates barriers to broad-ranging economic benefits for the families of sanitation workers and households seeking the basic right to safe sanitation. Next slide. CBS systems are not the best or the cheapest solution for everywhere. However, in some cases, they may be the only technologically possible and safe solution for vulnerable communities. People living in environmentally or politically fragile urban contexts are least able to wait for sewers or to manage the health burdens of unsafe sanitation. Where there is clearly an effective option to ensure safe and equitable sanitation access in urban settings, it should be deployed. Subsidized CBS is a way to improve access to safe sanitation for urban areas, particularly in areas without public infrastructure. Last slide, please. Changing the way development and public financing for basic services is dispersed in the absence of strong service authorities has proved challenging. However, the time has come to take a close look at the ways in which traditional CapEx financing has excluded vulnerable populations, perpetuating inequitable access to sanitation. A shift towards service subsidies and a mindset which recognizes that undoing centuries of inequality requires investment would represent a significant step towards a vision of safe and equitable service provision for all. I want to say thank you to all of you. I also want to say I looked at the participant list and I thought, when I say this last thing about the time has come, about 70% of this audience is going to say, that time came decades ago and we've been saying it for decades. So I want to say that I recognize the work of all of you out there who have been looking at this for quite some time. And I look forward to hearing our panel talk a bit about what are the barriers and why are we not there yet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sasha, for that amazing presentation. And I think, and when we think about, and Poonam will talk more to this specifically, and one of the reasons we've seen the level of hesitation towards doing sort of some form of O&M subsidy, right? We see that in solid waste management, but doing that for sort of particularly non-networked models in whether it's liquid waste or drinking water, it's probably just the worry that it's, and the World Bank paper talks about it, that it's going to be entrenched, right? Like once you do a subsidy, you can never totally do away with it. And I think for me, when we were doing the work with soil and looking at the data, what was particularly fascinating was the non-linear correlation between scale and, costs. And as you get the support to scale and you go from 1 to 2 and 2 to 10%, there is a non-linear reduction in variable costs. And there is so much more potential for operational efficiencies through technology innovation, like shifting to window composting, which I think is fascinating. And so much opportunity to structure some of that through results-based financing, and thinking differently about this worry that we have that once I put down that amount, it's going to stay that the number is going to stick there, and I'm always going to have to do that for everyone. And I feel like that's not true. It's all about how you structure it. And I remember Lusaka used the word discounts when they did their emptying subsidies. They didn't call it a subsidy; they called it a discount to just because they didn't, it was because the language changed the way people perceived it. And Poonam, with that, I'll hand it over to you to talk about India and your experience as Safe Water Enterprise, because you've successfully built and scaled this model largely on market-based revenues. So what is the role of public financing? And go ahead, Poonam, over to you.
Thank you, Deepa. Hello, everyone. I'm Poonam Seva from Safe Water Network, Vice President, Programs and Partnership. Safe Water Network is a New York-based NGO working in India and Ghana. And in India, we are providing safe water access to 1.3 million people every day, which is affordable. With USAID support, in 2016, we founded the Safe Water Enterprise Alliance, or what we call as SEVA Alliance, and scaled up this program across India. In India, along with my partners, we are working in 11 states. I will be sharing with you the findings from the field interventions of what we are and how the numbers look like, what are the reasons for the program succeeding, and what are the barriers and failures which need subsidy or some type of support so that they can be scaled. Next slide, please. The UN SDG Sustainable Development Report of 2020 said that if we look at the numbers from 2015 to 2020, there was a 4% increase from 70 to 74 in safely managed drinking water services, which means almost 2 billion people today are not having safely managed water. If the provision for water continues at the same speed, by 2030, we will reach the goal of 81, which means 1.6 billion people will be still beyond safely managed drinking water. So there is a need for 4 times acceleration. Next slide, please. Coming close and looking at India about the UN SDG Goal 6, the government of India initiated a series of flagship programs and invested more than $90 billion to provide safe water access. Still, there are 63 million people in India who are without safe drinking water. Next slide, please. How are we currently providing safe water to these people who are beyond the pipe, who are staying in quality affected habitations? So these people are provided safe water through Safe Water Enterprises, or water ATMs, as it is popularly called. Water ATMs are decentralized, cost-effective, safe drinking water solutions. They are present largely in the rural space and the urban space. In the urban space, they are in low-income communities. However, they are getting a very strong foothold across the country in high footfall areas, in hospitals, in bus stations, monuments, because they are able to provide affordable, safe water, which is at 5 to 7 cents per 20 liters for the communities in a jar where they come and collect their own water. And for the people on the go, it is about INR rupee 1 in a plastic bottle. So thus we are able to solve for many situations like public health improvement, generating livelihoods, improving well-being of poor, and at the same time preventing the plastic scourge. In India, since last 3 decades, almost 30 years, there are more than 50,000 safe water enterprises across the country, and they are operated and managed on a national level by more than 30 implementers. Next slide, please. What are the models in which the safe water enterprises are working? So basically, the model is a public-private partnership which can take various forms like engineering, procurement, and construction, the EPC model, build, own, operate, and transfer model, the annuity model, which is the hybrid model, and the social entrepreneur model. The hybrid annuity model is one of the models which can be scaled up very fast because it's a mix of EPC and BOT annuity with the government and the private developer. There is a cost sharing of 40 to 60%. The government provides funding, which is a sort of viability gap funding that cuts the overall debt requirement of the private developer and improves the return. Under this model, the government pre-arranges land acquisition, environmental clearances before handing over the asset. Also, the user fee is collected by the private entrepreneur or the government as per the arrangement, and the government pays the fixed annuity with the agreed profit margin. And this is an important step because it is able to attract the private sector into the safe drinking water through safe water enterprises. Safe water enterprises are today in the policy document of the Government of India, and they are largely supported. The model is very well defined. Next slide, please. So this is the slide which has got the lessons from almost 10 SWE implementers, and we studied over 100 models across the country in various states. So it's an average indicator of the numbers which I'm going to share. When we were working out the viability gap funding or the service need, we did it in the cluster mode because this initiative is successful only in the cluster mode. If we look at the capex is usually $20,000 to $25,000, and through the revenues generated from the daily water sales, the local operating costs are covered. And these local operating costs include payment for electricity, the raw water, the operator salary, and the return of the entrepreneur. What is not covered? Almost 31 to 32% of the costs are not covered. Which are these costs? 21% of the cost is for the field support, 5% monitoring and evaluation costs, 2% water quality and testing, 4% consumer activation. So in a cluster of 20, if we work it out, annually, there is a need for $1,000 per water ATM or station. And the whole objective of the Seva Alliance under the USAID program was to bring economies of scale, develop an ecosystem so that the sector is able to minimize the cost of consumer activation, of skilling and training, and to find out what are the other methods in which we can work together. If we look at the scenario of safe water enterprises across the country, the mortality rate is very high. It is as high as 30%. So how does one reduce it? Because affordable safe drinking water is definitely needed for the communities. Next slide, please. So if we look at the impact of critical intervention areas and the potential for resource management, we will find that if we maximize the values from existing public funding and development partners through result-based financing and better subsidy targeting, requires the least reforms and is one of the most preferable method of funding. The colleagues before me from the sanitation sector spoke about the subsidies and the various way in which they are trying to target. The second one, which is working in the water sector, is funding by cross subsidization and reform of tariffs. Unfortunately, there is a battle there are three battles with respect to pricing. One is what is mandated by the government because it's a public-private partnership, so we work under that shadow. The second one is the willingness and ability of the consumer to pay. And the third is that we are unable to utilize the capacities of the installations that we make. So under these three forces, cross-subsidization is becoming difficult. An important measure would be to reform the water sale price point, which can help generate sustainability for the safe water enterprises. Next slide, please. This is about the impact bonds. In the water sector, safe water enterprise sector, we are yet to see the role of impact bonds. They are very much discussed. However, the sector has not received any funding or interest in impact bonds, either from the giver, the funder, or the receiver. Next slide, please. What are the places where safe water enterprises are getting funded? So one of the most funding possibility was through the result-based funding. So here the funder is giving subsidies or viability gap funding depending on the revenues generated, the volume sold, the consumer participation, or the uptime, whatever is the impact that they are keen to measure. In this result-based funding models, so these services were being financed, especially during the COVID-19. The sector received a lot of funding from various funders in this mode. Next slide, please. The operational viability gap funding. This is the case study from one of the states in India, which had set up 18,000 water ATMs to provide affordable, safe drinking water to the citizens. They were primarily set up in the rural space. And to balance the affordability and operational viability, the government had to step in to directly reimburse the difference through cash viability, costing nearly $30 million. And it also extended a power subsidy of $20 million. So if we are wanting to get the SWEs sustainable, here the government measured the functionality of the SWEs only on the basis of the volume and the time and the duration for which the SWE was open. Next slide, please. There are examples of mixed subsidies in cash and kinds paid by the municipality, especially if they are putting up SWEs in the hospitals or courts or schools, where the free water and electricity is already provided to the SWE implementer, and the reimbursement of the operating costs and the refurbishment costs are given on actuals. Telescoping pricing for pro-poor subsidy is practiced, I think, almost in 8 or 9 states of India. And let me take the example from the Delhi Jal Board, which is providing 20,000 liters of free piped water access to 0.53 million households. And how are they subsidizing it? Through the telescopic pricing, where the city's rich people are subsidizing the poor. Next slide, please.
Poonam, 30 seconds, please. Okay.
Yes. So what are the key takeaways? The key takeaways is that water cannot be fully priced. Water utilities need long-term subsidies. The easiest method is to do result-based financing, incentivize private sector participation by reducing the funding gap in the long term, and promote innovations like solar or digital payment to reduce the operating cost. Next slide, please. I would like to thank all my Seva Alliance partners who have contributed to the slide which spoke about the numbers and how we can work together to create subsidies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Poonam. That was an amazing presentation. And, in the interest of time, I'm going to kick us off with the panel discussion, because we have an amazing panel day. We have implementers, we have donors, funders, thinkers. I request all the panelists to go on video, please, so that I'm going to just do a quick round of introductions, and maybe you could just quickly wave as I call out your name, and we're going to go into the panel Q&A. Please feel free to keep the questions coming in, and we're going to do our best to answer as many of those questions in writing. We'll try and take some of them up in the panel discussion as well. And Eddie, I might even kick off the panel discussion with the question you've raised, because it's an important one. Can I request all the panelists, Dr. Parag Agarwal, Jean Martin, Ben Mandel, Elise, Barbara, Jesse. Awesome. Okay. Great. We have the whole panel. Awesome. Excellent. I'm glad. I know we had some difficulty early on with participants trying to join the Pathable link, but it's great to see everyone here. I'm actually, because, Parag, we just heard some of the service providers speak. So we have, and I'll do a quick round of introductions. We have Dr. Parag Agarwal, who is the founder of a small water enterprise, a drinking water service provider in India, who's actually successfully built and scaled the model at the moment entirely on market-based revenues. Jean Martin from the World Bank is a senior water and sanitation specialist handling Latin America and the Caribbean. Ben Mandel, who is a senior utilities advisor at water.org, a not-for-profit that does a lot of work around designing market-based financial instruments. Elise Schreckengost, who I've learned so much from on the job on this topic, a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who leads the citywide inclusive sanitation initiative, and Barbara Evans, who needs no introduction to any of you here, just a chair of the Public Health Engineering Department at Leeds University. So thrilled. And Jesse, I'm so glad you could join us as well from USAID, who is, again, a senior WASH advisor and also the focal point for sanitation in the Global Health Bureau at USAID. So it's so great to have you all. I'm going to kick us off with really the question that Eddie just raised, Parag. Of course, feel free to speak to, obviously, you've done well in pockets and you've done well with customers that can pay. And you've made an argument in some of the work that you've presented in the past that you need formal support to scale your model, particularly within underserved communities. Would you sort of see the government, would the subsidy then be targeted to the private sector service provider, or is it just better to directly give households the money, like do direct cash vouchers? What's your thinking on that, and how, as a service provider, how would you respond to Eddie's question?
Well, thank you. That's a question layered with multiple questions within. So, I'll try and do my best to address it. But yes, coming from the operator's side, I can tell you, we started in 2030. I mean, I'm not going to speak about the background because I think Mrs. Poonam Sevak has done ample justice to, laying out the landscape in front of everyone. But from the operator's point of view, I'd like to say here that we started in 2013 by also installing static plants to cater to communities. And what we realized very quickly was that it was falling into the same bucket as all the others, where there was a viability gap, which was as wide as a chasm, and then we went into further, deep diving into understanding what the root cause was. And we realized that the root cause of the water sector largely being unviable or unfeasible or facing this viability gap problem or deficit was accessibility, the need for increased accessibility. So very quickly by 2017, what we did was we decided to start working on the accessibility aspect. And instead of, people coming to water, we decided to take water to people. And that's when we developed the Janajal Wow and created a water on wheels, which is a last mile delivery model. And when we started, we were catering to people at railway stations at 5 rupees a litre, and where people were coming to that kiosk and collecting water, while we then reverse engineered and built a last mile delivery model to deliver safe water to people's doorsteps at their households for 1 Indian rupee per litre. And this became a phenomenal game changer. We've been working on it for 5 years. COVID obviously set us back, but even during COVID, we were able to reach out to migrant workers, all the stranded communities, and people who really, were strapped for lack of drinking water. And now we've actually rolled out fleets. And, if you allow me, I'm going to quickly try and share just one slide to give people an idea of what we are talking about here. It's just to put the entire submission into perspective. So these are three-wheelers, extremely agile, extremely flexible, fungible, and they're mobile assets. You know, they go up to the doorstep of people, as you can see on this picture below. It's completely IoT monitored, controlled, qualitative, quantitative aspects. Poonamji referred to digital payments. So everything is digitally recorded here. We have data of which household is collecting how much water, what was the quality of the water that they collected, what was the quantity, and all of this is creating I mean, I can tell you the uptake is so rapid that we're almost now flummoxed with the kind of response that we are getting from people who are willing to become subscribers. They want now 25 liters, 30 liters, 20 liters, some want 400 liters delivered to them every day at a specified time, because that is their consumption. And they like the transparency that we are bringing to water through this entire effort. The other thing I must also mention here is the IoT tech platform that we built. We also IoTized existing water treatment plants. So what we decided to do was to harness the unutilized capacity or the spare capacity on existing plants. We decided to install the IoT controllers and sensors, marry them with the JJ WOWs, as we call them, Janajal WOWs, the water on wheels, and operate this in a hub and spoke model around within every community. And through this, of course, we create jobs, we're empowering women, we're enabling children to go to school, and all the benefits I think everyone here understands. But the moot point here is that water for us is not a product. It has now emerged into a medium of change, a medium of galvanizing society, communities, making people feel, democratizing societies through the medium of safe drinking water, as we call it. To come to that question that you said, what is the role of subsidies? And this is exactly where subsidies, operating level, service level subsidies can actually accelerate this entire activity in the welfare of, your question was, should private sector companies get it, or should the benefit be given directly to consumers? I think it works either ways, one way or the other. So we call it the DBT, the direct benefit transfer. So, we have apps, and, consumers, households could be given a credit of, say, 600 liters a month as a direct benefit transfer, or it could be routed via the private sector operator. But one way or the other, I think people draw much more trust. They derive far more confidence in the operation when there's a private sector execution agency involved. And that has been our experience. They like to see it being done under the auspices of the government, of the public stakeholders, but the execution should be privately, delivered to them. So they get far more confident that they will be heard whenever they have something to say.
Thank you, Parag. I think, to summarize, you're saying whether you give the money to us or you give it to households, we have more customers at the end of the day, and that's a good thing. Except that you're probably targeting better.
Not customers, we have more beneficiaries. There are
Right.
more that we can reach out to.
Excellent. No, thank you. This is amazing so much, and please keep the questions coming in, and we'll try and take more of those. I want to kind of pivot a little bit and just talk to the development financing institutions and the donors and the funders here with us, because clearly, I know some of you, may have been part of the presentations that Soil and Safe Water Network, shared with us earlier. Clearly, there's a space for these models. There are specific customers that can only be serviced through these service models, but they don't the systems are just not as mature in terms of, being able to contract, regulate, finance these service models. And so, there is a place for these service models, but as a financing institution, you struggle, I assume there's a struggle there to navigate and support those systems when it's not that formal. Jean-Martin, maybe I'd start with you there. I'd love to hear how the World Bank has been navigating that sort of sector maturity gap, for lack of a better word, as you try and support these models.
Thanks a lot for the great presentations and the question on that. I mean, when I was looking at the question and preparing for it, I was thinking, it's as if we're still treating non-sewered sanitation as let's say like an innovation but we're not given it the chance to go through the whole innovation cycle. No? And what I mean by this is that, and I've worked in Haiti for many years. I've interacted with soil in some way, and I'm completely convinced also that this is a very good model for Haiti and certain parts of it at least. And you know, the innovation cycle is one where you test new ideas quickly, you fail quickly, you iterate, and then you start spreading and scaling what works. And in the case of and I'm not saying that's the case for soil in Haiti. I think it's proven that it works. But in many cases, in many countries I've worked in, we don't allow ourselves to go through that cycle. No, and so we stop at the idea is new. Okay, well, I don't know, you know, and this is it. It really makes my job harder because my job becomes one of just awareness raising rather than implementation support, and it should be skewed towards implementation support, not awareness raising. I think we all know, all the people that are connected today all know that we've done a lot of awareness raising on how these models work. You know, so for me, when I look at this, is of course there's going to be still from my end awareness raising, advocacy, etc. But I think we need to give these models the chance to complete the innovation cycle, meaning reaching the scaling up part. And at least that's how I've approached it in some of my projects in Haiti, for example, but in other countries as well, where I always reserve a part of the projects to make sure we go through that innovation cycle, at least during the implementation project of our projects, that we reach the confidence that this is ready for scale. No? And I think that's very important. We need to make sure that we give that space to these models that are not new, and I'm going to insist on that. We know they've been around for a while and they've proven that they can work, but because they're still seen as business as unusual, it's difficult for us to go through breaking that ceiling, let's say.
Thanks, John Martin. And I know, Elise, you and the team at the Gates Foundation is trying to make this more business as usual by supporting and allying with DFIs like the World Bank and the ADB, and supporting that process of not just awareness, but actually strengthening public service systems to do this well in the non-network space, particularly in sanitation. We'd love to hear more about some of the things that you're doing and what you're learning from those experiences.
Great. Thanks, Deepa, and thanks to everyone who's already spoken. There's so much that's already been said. It's hard to recap some of these really important points and figure out how to fit this in. But I think I just want to say that there is that cycle of innovation, and I think, Jean-Martin, it's so important that you recognize that, but also that we recognize, as you said, that this isn't always new. And the way I think about it is that there's a cost to transition. And so when you transition, when a utility is thinking about transitioning formally from being a networked service provider to an outcome service provider, not looking at only piped water or piped sanitation, but how do you reach the people in your service area with sanitation and water services, irrespective of the hardware that's required and irrespective of the hardware financing that you have right now? Everyone needs both of those services right now. How does a utility take up the mandate, whether it's a licensing change or otherwise, once they have that new mandate to reach people with services? What's that transition period look like? And I think it's you can call it the cycle of innovation, but every utility that it gets an expanded mandate is going to have to go through that transition period, because the market has to evolve. Customers' expectations have to evolve, and the utilities service systems itself, their data systems, their customer engagement systems, all of that has to go through a transition period, and it costs money. And so two of the projects that I'll just flag right now in Kampala and in Lusaka, both of those, in Kampala, it's a city authority that we're working with, and in Lusaka, it's a utility that we're working with. In both of those cases, the sanitation authority is thinking through how to formalize services and reach people at scale, particularly inclusive of the lowest income customers. And the subsidies that are being tested and developed in those situations both of them are going to evolve as the systems evolve. In the case of Lusaka, they have subsidies most are that are directed more to the provider. And in that case, the goal is, one, to reduce the gap between cost of service provision and price of affordable price of service provision, and also to help those customers get to the providers, the private sector providers that are being contracted to the utility, help them get to a higher point of efficiency so that their cost of providing services starts to come down. And I like to think about those as kind of, they are service subsidies, but they're also service subsidies that are specifically designed to be shorter term and to bring greater efficiency and greater equity to the overall system, so that service authorities like Lusaka Water can reach the people who most need services and have been excluded from public finance for the longest time. In Kampala, the subsidy goes directly to the consumers, but it also is important to generate for generating demand for the emptiers, growing their demand effectively, and allowing them to plan with longer horizons and more effectively to also achieve efficiencies and lower costs. In that case, the sustainability of that program is still in question because it's a research program. In the case of Lusaka, that's tied to their utility mandate, and they're getting support not just from development partners who are helping to pay for upgrading pits so that emptying can be done more efficiently, like the World Bank and African Development Bank. But they're also getting subsidies, an allowance for cross subsidy from their regulator, who's tracking their KPIs, has developed new KPIs for their non-sewer sanitation service delivery and their Procore targets, but is also giving them space to use some of those cross subsidies and revenue from other parts of their business enterprises to help facilitate that transition. And so they're not only kind of giving top-ups based on performance, but also subsidizing some of the hardware costs that emptiers need to be more efficient before they're really profitable. So things like an additional set of barrels, an additional trailer, so that they don't have to run their trucks through traffic every single time they empty a pit. They can empty 2 or 3 pits before they have to get stuck in traffic. Those are discrete one-off subsidies that help emptiers get to that higher point of efficiency and start to close that efficiency gap. And they're the kinds of investments that we need to be thinking about using development finance for, to improve the overall efficiency of services as we help utilities move toward through a transition period that's expensive in terms of just allowing people to learn their new jobs in the private sector and the public sector, work out new systems and work out evolving systems, because every few months there's a new efficiency point and a new opportunity. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elise. This is so interesting because, and I think, and I want to bring Jesse, you and Ben into the conversation here in terms of just how, because we're all talking about unlocking efficiencies and stimulating the private sector, if that's one way to put it. And I know the USAID or some of the work you're supporting or leading, Jesse, under USAID sort of is almost looking at sort of an alternative way of doing the same thing, not depending on public support, but trying to find market-based ways of engaging and developing private sector. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on how that's worked, for instance, and what, in your view, can we actually do this without formal public support, and in spite of formal public support? And of course, a follow-up to Ben, which I'll come in a minute, but Jesse, maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I hope it's not an alternative approach. I think the approach we're trying or investing in, I guess you call like market-based water and market-based sanitation approaches. I think it's all part of the same approach. It's just maybe a little bit more emphasis on engaging the private sector to deliver services. But I think the public sector is always going to have to continue to invest. And I think that's That's shown out by the presentation from Safe Water Network, that even in water supply, subsidies are needed long-term. Sanitation, I mean, it's definitely, it's a more dire situation. I think both the business part of it, generally the profit margins are very low, regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's fecal sludge management, collection, and emptying, whether it's selling latrines, whether it's operating the treatment plants, or any part of these sanitation value chains. The profit is very low. The willingness to pay for these services is often quite low. And sanitation is just expensive. So it's going to require subsidies, probably more than the water sector. I think governments are just also not investing in it. So there's less public money available for it. And when there is, it's it's usually directed at construction of things. When we actually, like Jean-Martin was saying, we need this an extended period to bore out the models that deliver these things and the technologies that deliver these things. Not only is it targeted at construction, but often it's targeted poorly to construction that's going to help the well-off parts of the population, and not targeted to those that need the services most. And then there's poor coordination, I think, also between actors in the sanitation sector. We often see this where, we might be trying a market-based approach, and then we'll run into an actor that's trying the opposite approach, maybe on untargeted direct subsidies that will conflict and can really disrupt the markets and make it tough to establish those markets and make them work. We just completed a study on use of targeted sanitation subsidies in Ghana last year. This is really to try out some approaches that have been tried already in Asia and shown some promise, and really wanted to see how combining that market-based approach and a targeted subsidy with traditional sanitation approaches, how those all can work together. And I think what we really find is, these sanitation approaches, they all need to work together, and that market absolutely needs to be in place. And so we almost can't progress without developing the market in all these targeted regions. That's so key to the progress. But that subsidies are always going to be required, not just for capital infrastructure, but for the ongoing costs. And the last thing I'll say is that I think one of the other big challenges we face, particularly in sanitation, more so than water, is that there's a view that the return on investment for these is also low. And so even when public funding comes around, when development banks and stuff look to invest in this area, there's views that there's poor return on investment. And this is often because we're looking for these short-term wins, short-term projects, some sort of silver bullet or technology to solve the problem, when it's really what we've learned from all these projects and experiences around the world is it's market development in particular is a long-term process. There's lots of learning involved. And so we gotta look to, since we're all kind of working in these same timelines of short projects, 3 to 5 years, usually we have to look at phased projects or sequential projects, I think, to develop these markets over time, and not think of it as such a short-term goal. Over.
Thank you, Jesse. No, that's interesting. So we need subsidies. Bad subsidies can do more harm than good. But good subsidies can actually crowd in private finance and capital. And a good subsidy can actually scale business models in ways that market-based sanitation approaches standalone cannot. Is that sort of a fair summary? Because you tend to, and it's like one of those cases, the pilots always succeed and the scale-ups never do. So I feel it's simply because they don't have the sort of scale and financing support that a public institution can offer an outreach. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're talking about money, it's dangerous, right? You can have
Yeah.
a disruptive effect and you can have a positive effect. So we got to be careful with how that's directed. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Jesse. And then, of course, like, because I think what makes water.org fascinating is because you recognize that there's a financing gap and that needs to be met. But the approach you've taken is to kind of, again, think about like microcredit, for instance, as a way of intervening and filling that gap, while, you know, the World Bank and others are trying to kind of find ways. I'm curious to hear what your experience has been in some of those market-based instruments as a way to address that financing gap. And yeah, please go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Deepa. Water.org does indeed love to focus on solutions at scale. To date, Water.org has reached 49 million people through 11 million loans, representing just under $4 billion in capital mobilized. Now, most of that impact represents small loans to households, averaging about $350 each. In addition, Water.org has recently been expanding beyond households to include financing to SMEs and utilities. When it comes to household finance, supportive regulations that encourage microfinance lending for non-income generating purposes, such as water and sanitation, are certainly very helpful. Moreover, when possible, we try to work alongside governments when they lead initiatives that can benefit from additional financing. One example is the Government of India's Swachh Bharat campaign, where we saw private finance serve as a complementary way to public subsidies. We saw microfinance help fill a gap when public subsidies were insufficient for household investment needs. We also saw microfinance provide bridge financing, as most of the public subsidies were structured as output-based, and therefore the payments were only made after the facility was constructed. Another example is our work with community-based small pipe water suppliers in Indonesia. Typically, these CBOs serve a few hundred households, and most CBOs were established through public funding, thanks to the government of Indonesia and the World Bank, through full CapEx grants. However, these grants were limited in size, and as a result, only about 25% of the households in any given village connect to their piped network. To date, little public funding has been made available to expand or improve the CBOs. So, Water.org, through its partners, works to mobilize additional capital by improving the financing readiness of the CBOs and de-risking the lending transactions. For instance, we work with CBOs to better document their financial results and then use that information to develop investment plans that allow for capital raising and infrastructure creation. A key part of this process has been Water.org's effort to de-risk the loan by offering a partial loan loss guarantee. Now, initially, we piloted this as an in-house guarantee and managed to show a strong repayment history. Over time, we were able to transition this guarantee to third-party financial institution organizations. And today, in some cases, we have government budgets actually paying for the cost of this loan insurance as a form of public subsidy. From an impact perspective, our partners have dispersed over 500 loans to CBOs, mobilizing $1.3 million in capital with an average loan size of $2,400. And after the loans were dispersed, CBOs subsequently connected more than 25,000 new households to their networks. We definitely recognize that we have more work to do to scale this model, as there are over 30,000 CBOs in Indonesia. To that end, we're working with the government's main support program for CBOs called PAMSIMAS to institutionalize and scale this CBO capacity building approach. I think these two examples show how public and private financing can complement each other. And since the water and sanitation sector is chronically underfunded, this type of mutual support seems very promising. I think a blended finance design may or may not break down along CapEx and OpEx lines, but I think that is totally fine. Context influences so much. And if the programs are well considered, follow sector best practices, and have the opportunity to be refined during implementation, I believe public subsidies can be an effective tool to increase inclusivity and improve WASH access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's fascinating because and clearly, and the fact that you've managed to get the government to take on an initiative that you started in terms of and finance that, I think is fantastic. But would you say this is unique to community-based organizations at the scale of financial needs that's perhaps more relevant or sort of in that segment, while a Safe Water Network or a Janajal or a CBS may actually be a different demand situation altogether? Or do you think there are similarities from a financing need perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I do see similarities and some differences. So if we talk about the size of financing, I think the Safe Water Networks were estimating roughly $1,000 in annual subsidies needed to maintain each ATM. So these loans to improve the infrastructure and expand the service are in the range of a few thousand. So the scale and potential sources of financing could be similar. The CBOs in Indonesia, some are break even on a service basis, some aren't. So we also see, I think that's a similarity. And most of the CBOs are community owned, so they're not private sector entrepreneurs, but they do have local people working to maintain those systems. And so there also are some maybe similar dynamics around operation efficiencies and kind of ensuring any kind of subsidies wouldn't have a negative impact on the performance. So those are a few examples that come to me.
That's really useful. Thank you so much, Ben. I think, and Barbara, I'm gonna look to you to actually close us today, because I feel that there's such rich, such valuable perspectives. I've learned so much on this session. And Barbara, you've had the opportunity to think about this, right, within a development financing context, and now as an academic, and you've written about and you've talked about the need for more money and more targeted support for water and sanitation. Why is this such a persistent problem still? Why are we still struggling? And if there were a couple of messages, particularly to development partners and funders, what would those be, Barbara?
Yeah, thank you, Deepa. And yes, can't reiterate enough how interesting this is. So I think it's still a problem in part because, with honorable exceptions on this call, there's a huge number of people in the world that still think of, I'm going to talk about sanitation, but a lot of what I say will relate to water. I think a lot of people still think about sanitation as an infrastructure intervention. So they think about infrastructure, and therefore all their sort of logic of financing is geared towards building the infrastructure. And what's not really well understood is the long-term sort of operational and financing liability. You know, you need to borrow money to build your infrastructure, and you need an ongoing income to run that service. And if we shift that thinking to a service, that would be a start. However, I think the other related problem is that a lot of that service delivers benefits which are public and much broader than the service which is attached to the household infrastructure. And I think those connections create a lot of confusion, particularly, I mean, amongst some donors, I think amongst some governments, and I think amongst some NGOs. Ironically, I think those problems become even worse for a lot of people delivering pro-poor services, because I think a lot of those get associated even more strongly with the particular piece of infrastructure, you know, rather than with the service. And it's seen as something that's somehow like off the network or sort of separate from the service. And I want to just give a shout out to my colleagues in all of the CBS providers who have then the additional layered challenge, I think, that somehow they're also expected to be self-financing private entities that generate profit. So we're kind of like layering these incorrect types of analysis onto people that are actually trying to get to these hard to reach people. Fundamentally, I think the word subsidy is deeply unhelpful, particularly in the water sector, because I think it's associated with the idea of providing partially funded toilets, to be brutally honest, or partially funded hand pumps. So in many ways, I think if we could really reshape this conversation around sustainable public finance, that would make a huge difference. I think the other thing is that we've got into a weird sort of discourse around the idea that you can, and this is no criticism to anyone here, but I think there's a discourse that certain technology approaches are somehow not networked in a municipal sense. And I think that's deeply unhelpful, because all urban sanitation services, all water services, most sanitation everywhere, increasingly as the world sort of densifies and people are looking at higher levels of service, are actually somehow networked. It's not just something which stands alone at the household level. If I could say one thing to donors, and actually, again, I don't think it's really the donors on this call, and I would say very often it's actually a lot of the sort of non-governmental actors, some of the smaller actors coming into the sector, absolutely nobody here. If I could say a couple of things that are really important. First of all, I think we need to think about financing for sanitation in a technology neutral way, because the outcome we're all looking for is exactly the same for every type of service. So the idea that just because one way of delivering the service has a bit more infrastructure built close to the house, that doesn't mean you layer more financial liability to the household necessarily. So some kind of technology neutral approach that looks at how we finding the money for the whole network system. The second thing I would say to most donors is there is no sanitation system in the world that's self-financing. Elise said it, Jessie said it, I think probably other people have said it. You know, neither are they self-financing, neither do they need to be self-financing from, if you're, when I say self-financing, I mean covered from the tariff alone, because a big chunk of the service is not the service that the household is purchasing. What households are purchasing is the convenience at household level. What the city is paying for is a clean, safe city and no feces in the supply chain for your fresh produce, and no feces, no AMR developing in your open drainage, and a whole bunch of other things which really are public finance questions. The final thing I want to say is when you think about sanitation like that, we can also say, and I know Jessie said this, but I would slightly contest, and I think as a sector we have to stop saying sanitation is expensive. Sanitation is expensive if you think about it in isolation, and if you think about the full cost of building all the infrastructure that you need tomorrow. But if you really look at the financial structuring of an infrastructure investment with its service delivery liability, and you think about how much money would I need as a city every year to make sure that I'm servicing my debt and running my system, I mean, my analysis says that that's somewhere around $400 per household per year to 5 or 6, you know, it depends a little bit on context. Are you seriously telling me that a service that is saving this many lives and has this much public utility is expensive if it's around about $400 per household, which is incidentally for everybody's benefit, about 1/20 of what we all spend on chocolate in the world. So that's my final message to donors. Let's stop saying this is expensive, and let's start saying this is a genuine liability that public sector service providers should be taking on. And we as donors can look at how we can most efficiently, everybody's used the word efficiently, help people deliver the financial flow that they need to deliver those services.
Amazing. Very clear and bold messages, Barbara, and a clear cry for a shift in language. I might have said non-networked at least 10 times in this conversation, right? Like, and I'm like, maybe we should stop saying non-networked, because it does create that binary in our heads, and it deepens that focus on I'm funding this infrastructure model versus this infrastructure model. And therefore, in some sense, I almost start imagining an approach of financing that's specific to that infrastructure project is against talking about sustainable public financing. And I think that's such an important message. And because finally, it's like running a company, right? You want to run it sustainably and viably, and you find ways to, you see an opportunity, you serve that market, but with a welfare motivation, really. And let's stop saying subsidies. And Lusaka had this interesting, they called it discounts. They said, we're not going to call it a subsidy. Lusaka Water Supply said, we're going to call it a discount. So because the discount automatically shifts this, you stop thinking it's permanent. You say, oh, it's like a one-off thing, right? Even though it could be permanent for some customer groups. But so a bold call for action. Let's use different language as a sector, and some really valuable messages, Barbara. With that, thank you all for this really great session. I want to start from the top. Firstly, to the partners, Safe Water Network, Soil, Container-Based Sanitation Alliance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Incredibly grateful to all of you for helping us put this session together. Remy Kopp at the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance, Sasha Kramer at Soil, and Poonam Sevak at Safe Water Network for your amazing presentations earlier today. Thank you so much. And for this fantastic panel, Jean Martin, Jesse, Ben, Barbara, Elise, and Parag. Thank you all so much for your time. I do want to also thank my colleague Mitra, who's been working tirelessly. Mitra, if you could come on video for a second and say hi at the background to bring this group of people together and curate the content. And Ananya, and all the colleagues from India who are joining us at such an ungodly hour. Thank you all. This has been great. And we will share the key insights and takeaways from this conversation and look forward to keeping this going. Thank you all so very much and have a great rest of your. Enjoy the World Water Week, all the other sessions.
Thank you, Deepa.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deepa.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
That was amazing, Barbara. Thank you. And
I'm really sorry I was late, guys. My computer died while I was in the meeting room. I'm at another meeting, so I just had to run the whole length of a really, really huge hotel to get to my room to find a cable and then run back to the meeting room to get another computer. So I'm so sorry. I'm sure you were. I hope you weren't.
no, that I am, because I'm so.